The cliff doesn't shake, it breathes. That's how Wei Huan described it. A scholar who survived the night of January 23, 1556, and spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he felt. He said the tiles on his roof made a sound like 10,000 horses galloping. Thieves were his first thought. Then, demons. Only when the wall against his head collapsed did he realize it was the earth moving beneath him. Wei Huan was lucky. His mother, his brothers, his nephew, they were already in the open field when he stumbled through the breach. Most of his neighbors never made it that far. By morning, in some counties along the Wei River Valley, 60% of the population was dead. But here's what that death toll doesn't tell you. The earthquake itself didn't kill 830,000 people. The fault line didn't make the decision. The Ming Dynasty did. Slowly, across 2 centuries, one carved hillside at a time. This is the story of how a civilization built its own death trap and what happened the night someone finally set it off. The Loess Plateau in northwest China is unlike any landscape on Earth. Windstorms blowing east from the Gobi Desert deposited fine silt across the region over thousands of years, building up layers of compressed clay, Loess, that in some places runs 300 meters deep. Soft enough to cut with a hand tool, warm in winter, cool in summer, and, under the right conditions, load-bearing enough to hold a roof. The people of Shaanxi Province had been carving homes directly into these Loess cliffs for centuries. They called them Yaodong, cave dwellings, and by the 16th century, millions of families lived in them. Not because they had no choice, because they were practical. A Yaodong cost almost nothing to build. It required no timber, no stone, no skilled labor. You dug horizontally into a hillside, carved out a chamber, perhaps added a brick facade at the entrance. The cliff did the rest. The Wei River Valley, running 500 miles through the heart of Shaanxi, was one of the most densely populated stretches of land in the known world. Large cities, Xi'an, Shenyang, Lintong, lined its banks. Between them, hundreds of thousands of families lived pressed into the faces of those soft yellow cliffs. By 1556, the region housed somewhere between 60 and 100 million people. Historians disagree on the exact figure, in a world whose entire population was barely 500 million. China alone may have accounted for 40% of every human being alive. What nobody said out loud, what the imperial records had been quietly noting for 2,700 years, was that the ground beneath them had a habit of moving. The Wei River Basin sits at the intersection of 3 major fault lines at the complex tectonic boundary where the Indian and Eurasian plates press against each other. Chinese annals recorded the first major earthquake in this valley in 1177 BC. By 1556, the records logged 36 large earthquakes in this basin. 36. The knowledge existed, the pattern was documented, and the dynasty had built its most vulnerable population directly on top of it. By January of 1556, the Ming Dynasty was already in trouble, and it knew it. The Jiajing Emperor, the 11th ruler of the Great Ming, had been on the throne for 34 years. He was not governing. Consumed by Daoist alchemy and a desperate search for the elixir of immortality, he had retreated from court politics entirely. Shaanxi Province had been neglected for decades. Major droughts struck the region in 1504 and again in 1528. Famines followed. Epidemics followed the famines. Corruption festered in the provincial offices as officials sought transfers to richer postings rather than stay and manage a region that offered them nothing. The people who lived in those Yaodong cliffs along the Wei River were, by and large, the poorest subjects in one of the world's wealthiest empires. And on the night of January 23, 1556, they were asleep. The earthquake struck in the early hours of the morning. Magnitude 8.0, centered near Huaxian in the heart of the Wei River Valley. The shaking was so violent it registered across 10 provinces, felt as far as Beijing, Shanghai, and Chengdu. Crevices opened in the earth up to 20 meters deep. Rivers overflowed, hills collapsed into valleys. In some places, entirely new hills rose from flat ground in seconds. The ground did not simply shake, it reorganized itself. and inside a million Loess cliff faces, the ceilings came down. The Yaodong didn't fail like a building fails, where the walls buckle and there's a moment to run. They failed like a lung collapsing. The soft clay above each chamber shuddered, cracked along the grain of its compression layers and dropped. Not the ceiling, the entire hillside. Families sleeping on their kangs, brick beds warmed from below by a fire, were buried before they were fully awake. Wei Huan crawled through a hole in his collapsing wall and ran for open ground. In the Yanman district of Anna County, the record states more than 10,000 crushed dead, one county, one night. For the survivors who made it into the open, the earth kept moving. Aftershocks came through the night, then the next day, then the following week. They would continue for 6 months. In county after county, the death percentages were recorded with the flat precision of Ming bureaucracy. 70% per capita dead in Nong'an and Puban, 60% in Hua County, 50% in Huaxian, 30% in the provincial capital. These weren't estimates, they were official reports compiled from surviving magistrates and sent to the imperial court in Beijing. The report that reached the Jiajing emperor stated that the number of officials, soldiers and civilians crushed to death and reported by name exceeded 830,000. Those not known by name or not yet reported were beyond counting. That number needs unpacking, and it's still widely misunderstood. Modern estimates from the China Earthquake Administration put direct deaths from the earthquake itself at roughly 100,000. The remaining 730,000 are population loss figures drawn from imperial hukou registration records, people who died from famine in the months that followed, from epidemics that spread through displaced camps, or who simply vanished from the census because they had fled and never returned. The earthquake triggered the collapse. The months after it are what turned 100,000 dead into 830,000 gone. Drop in the comments. At what point do you think the Ming Dynasty made this disaster inevitable, before the earthquake or after it? Because here's what the court actually did when it received those reports. The emperor issued a decree. He allocated 40,000 taels of silver for relief and ordered partial remissions of the grain tax. Modern historians have calculated what 40,000 taels represented, roughly 0.2 to 0.3% of the imperial government's annual revenues. One coin in every 400 collected, and that was the relief effort. The rest of the response was ritual. Stone stelae were erected near temples. Imperial proclamations admonished the local deities for permitting the disaster. Under the mandate of heaven, a calamity of this scale suggested the emperor had lost divine favor, so the court performed contrition rather than confronting the logistics of feeding a province. Meanwhile, the survivors were doing what the empire wouldn't. The morning after the earthquake, Wei Huan recorded what he saw. People going to and fro, weeping, running like bees that had lost their hive. Noon arrived and no one had eaten. The cooking utensils were buried, the grain was buried, rumors spread through the city. The inhabitants of Jian looted warehouses, and a county vice chief had 2 men beheaded in the street to restore order. In other provinces, local magistrates killed men with their own swords to stop the pillaging. Had the surviving authorities not applied force immediately, the Wei River plain would have descended entirely into chaos. The aftershocks that followed weren't only geological. Food supply was an aftershock. Social order was an aftershock. The farmland across the region had been shredded by landslides. Loess clay, under seismic force, behaves like quicksand. Fields that had fed the valley for generations were buried under new hills that hadn't existed the morning before. Livestock was gone. Granaries were rubble. And it was January in Shaanxi, the coldest stretch of the year, with no shelter and no fire. The people who survived the night of January 23rd would spend the following months being killed by what that night had taken from them. The Ming Dynasty survived the Shaanxi earthquake, barely and not for long. Within 13 years, a major bandit revolt broke out in the devastated province. Under the next emperor, famines struck so frequently that the starving had no option but to rebel. The dynasty that had once governed 40% of the world's population staggered through the following century and collapsed in 1644, not from a single blow, but from the accumulated weight of what it had refused to address. Across those 97 affected counties, one thing did change in the earthquake's aftermath. The survivors stopped carving their homes into cliffs. They rebuilt in bamboo and wood, flexible materials that could move with the earth rather than collapse beneath it. A lesson paid for in 830,000 lives finally learned. The 1556 Shaanxi earthquake remains the deadliest seismic event in recorded human history. The fault line that caused it is still active today. The city of Xi'an, ancient capital, 13 million people, the heart of the same Wei River Valley, sits directly above it. The deeper we dig into the past, the more we understand the present. I'm Zombo, and there's always more to discover.